The sun over Dry Creek had bleached every color from the town except rust, dust, and old blood. Mara Ellison stood beneath the mercantile awning, with a strip of harness leather across her left palm, and a cake of tallow in her right. She worked the grease into a split near the buckle hole, pressing with her thumb until the leather darkened and softened. The small task gave her something exact to do. Press, inspect, press again. 30 yards away, a crowd had gathered around the punishment post. The people of Dry Creek rarely agreed on anything. They argued over fence lines, card debts, church hymns, freight prices, and which family had first claim to the cottonwoods along the wash. But cruelty could unite them quickly. It made them feel less poor and less frightened. It let a man with a failing roof laugh at someone whose whole life had been pulled down around him. At the center of the ring stood Taza Tallwater. His wrists had been shackled to iron hooks sunk into the post. Another chain circled his ribs and pinned his back to the timber. The links were old enough to be black in the grooves and orange at the edges. Under the noon sun they had grown hot enough to blister skin. Someone had taken his shirt. Dust clung to his shoulders and to the long scars crossing his side. A bruise darkened one cheekbone. His mouth was split at the lower lip. He kept his eyes level with the rooftops and did not answer the men shouting at him. Mara knew why they wanted an answer. They did not merely want him punished. They wanted him to ask them to stop. Councilman Pike stood near the post with his thumbs hooked into his vest. He had a broad pink face and the soft hands of a man who ordered labor rather than doing it. Beside him, Deputy Wade Gentry rested one hand on his revolver and told anyone who asked that the prisoner had been caught scouting cattle near Caleb Rourke's northern range. No stolen cattle had been found. No weapon had been taken from him. There had been no hearing. That had not mattered. Rourke owned more grass than any man could ride across in a day, and Gentry wore a badge paid for with Rourke money. In Dry Creek, suspicion became law as soon as the right man repeated it. Mara bent the harness strap and watched the crack close. A drop of sweat slid from her temple, traveled behind her ear, and disappeared beneath the collar of her gray work dress. The air smelled of pine tar, horse urine, hot iron, and the sweet rot of melon rinds in a barrel behind the hotel. Taza's head lowered an inch. The crowd noticed and grew louder. Mara stopped rubbing the leather. She was 10 miles from home. In her wagon were 2 sacks of flour, a spool of fence wire, lamp oil, salt, and the last packet of bean seed the mercantile had in stock. She had paid too much for every item because Amos Pike's brother owned the store and because men who lived alone could be overcharged without fear of complaint. If she crossed the street now, she would pay more next month. Perhaps the miller would refuse her grain. Perhaps the clerk would lose her tax receipt. Perhaps a rider would begin appearing near her southern fence after dark. She knew the cost before she moved. Mara folded the repaired strap, set it on a flour barrel, and took a dented tin cup from her satchel. The town pump stood beside the livery trough. Its handle burned her palm through the calluses. She worked it once, twice, and a third time. The mechanism coughed air and rust flakes. On the 4th pull, cold water struck the cup hard enough to splash her sleeve. The sound drew eyes. She filled the cup to the rim and turned. The crowd did not open for her at first. She walked into it anyway. A ranch hand shifted aside, then another. Boots scraped the dirt. A woman near the bakery made the sign of the cross but said nothing. "Go back to your wagon, Miss Ellison," Deputy Gentry called. "This is council business." Mara kept walking. Pike stepped into her path. His breath smelled of onions and whiskey. "You give him that. You put yourself with him." "I'm carrying water," Mara said. "You heard me." "Yes." She went around him. Up close, the heat coming off the chain made her eyes sting. The iron had left red bands around Taza's wrists and a raw line beneath his ribs. His breathing was shallow, but his gaze remained clear. He looked at her face before he looked at the cup. That unsettled her more than anger would have. Mara lifted the cup. His hands could not move far enough to take it, so she had to step near the post and hold the rim to his mouth. "Slowly," she said. He leaned forward. The first swallow seemed painful. His throat worked once, stopped, then worked again. He did not gulp. He drank with control, though she could feel the faint tremor in his jaw against her knuckles. Water ran over the split in his lip and darkened the dust on his chest. Behind her, someone cursed. Pike told Gentry to pull her away. Gentry did not. The cup was between them, and for those few seconds the town had no place to enter. Taza finished every drop. Mara lowered her hands. He looked at her for a long moment, then dipped his chin. It was not submission and not gratitude offered for public display. It was acknowledgement. She turned and walked back through the crowd. No one touched her. Their silence followed her to the mercantile porch, where she put the cup in her satchel, loaded her flour, and tied the wagon canvas with hands that did not begin shaking until the knot was finished. A carriage rolled into town before she could climb to the seat. It was a government rig, black under the dust, drawn by 2 bay horses, whose harness brass had been polished that morning. A thin man in a dark coat stepped down carrying a leather case. His name was Arthur Pendleton, the circuit judge, and unlike most men who brought law to the frontier, he looked more irritated by disorder than impressed by power. He saw the post. "Who authorized this?" he asked. Pike hurried forward. His confidence vanished so quickly that Mara almost pitied him. The man was trespassing near Rourke cattle. Was he charged? We were holding him. In chains under a noon sun? Pike spread his hands. You know what these people are capable of. Pendleton removed his spectacles, wiped one lens with a handkerchief and put them back on. The small delay made the whole square wait. "I know what I am looking at," he said. "A prisoner without a warrant. Punishment without trial. A deputy standing beside it." Gentry's face tightened. Pendleton pointed to the chain. "Open it." Pike tried once more. "Judge, if that lock remains closed when I count 3, I will have the deputy arrested and the council dissolved pending territorial review." The blacksmith brought a key before Pendleton reached to. The lock resisted. Rust grated inside it. When it finally turned, the chain slid from Taza's chest and struck the dirt with a weighty clatter that silenced the town again. Taza remained upright. He flexed his fingers once, then rubbed the blood back into his wrists. Pendleton asked his name. Taza gave it. The judge asked whether he wished to file a complaint. "No," Taza said. It was the first word Mara heard from him. His voice was low and rough, as though he had not used it for days. He did not look at Pike or Gentry. He looked across the square at Mara. 3 heartbeats passed. Then he walked out of town toward the western canyons. Mara drove east to her homestead, telling herself the matter was finished. It was not. By midsummer, the creek beds had become roads for lizards. No rain had fallen in 14 weeks. The hills lost their green first. Then the grass around Mara's cabin turned the color of old rope. Her corn leaves folded inward. The bean vines stopped climbing. Even the sage gave off less scent because there was no moisture left in the leaves. Each morning Mara lowered a bucket into the well and listened. The wait before the splash grew longer. She measured water with a gourd. 2 scoops for the corn that still carried ears, 1 for each line of beans, nothing for the squash. She wrote the amounts in her father's ledger beside the flour count and cartridge count, as if neat numbers could make the land obey. Samuel Ellison had built the cabin 21 years earlier. He had felled the pines himself, hauled stone from the western gorge, and driven iron pipe through layers of gravel and hard clay until he reached an aquifer deep enough to make every rancher in the basin jealous. He had died 6 winters ago with his boots beside the hearth and his hands folded over his chest. Since then, Mara had kept the roof patched, the fence upright, and the taxes paid. Almost paid. The last receipt from Dry Creek sat beneath a flour tin. Mara had delivered the money. Clerk Edwin Sterling had promised to enter it. Weeks later, the county ledger showed a balance due. Mistake, Sterling called it. Mara called it a hook. Caleb Rourke had been circling her land for years. He owned cattle by the thousand, but cattle did not drink ownership papers. His North Creek had failed in June. His reservoirs were shrinking into hoof-churned pits. Mara's deep-water deed was the one thing he could not buy from her. He had offered once with a smile, once with a threat, and once through a bank notice. She refused all 3. The morning her deep pump began drawing mud, Rourke came in person. Mara had primed the leather seal with half a jug of drinking water. She worked the handle until the muscles in her shoulders burned and the cracked skin across her palms opened again. The pump groaned, caught, and spat a brown stream into the bucket. For a moment she smelled wet earth, then the flow thinned to a rope, then a thread, then nothing. She stood with both hands on the hot pump casing and stared into a bucket holding less than 2 inches of cloudy water. Hooves sounded on the east ridge. Mara wiped her palms on her apron, went to the porch, and took down her father's repeating rifle. Rourke rode a broad roan with a silver concho bridle. He wore a pale hat and a clean dark coat despite the heat. Deputy Gentry rode beside him on a gelding with foam dried around the bit. They stopped beyond the dead garden. "Morning, Mara," Rourke said. She did not answer. He looked at the muddy bucket near the pump and smiled without showing teeth. "Hard year. State your business." My business is to keep good land from becoming a grave. He reached into his coat and removed a folded contract. I'll pay the tax claim and take the water deed. You'll have enough to start elsewhere. Where? The question surprised him. He shrugged. Somewhere wetter. Mara adjusted the rifle across her forearms. I'm not selling the deed. Gentry leaned on his saddle horn. There's a boundary review in town. New survey says this pump sits a quarter-mile inside Rourke Range. My father's grant predates the town. That is for a judge to decide. Then bring the circuit judge. Rourke's pleasant expression thinned. By the time Pendleton rides this circuit again, your well will be dust. I am offering you a way to leave with dignity. My dignity is not yours to price. Gentry's hand moved toward his revolver. Rourke stopped him with a glance. You are alone, Rourke said. That fact has a cost, same as flour and fencing. Mara pulled the rifle hammer back. The click carried through the yard. If you cross my fence after dark, she said, the cost will be yours. Rourke studied her. The heat shimmered between them. His horse flicked flies with its tail and crushed a dry bean vine under one hoof. Finally, he turned the roan. A well can be ruined without a bullet, he said over his shoulder. Sleep lightly. They rode away. Mara remained on the porch until the dust settled. Inside, she cleaned the rifle twice. She checked the shutters, moved a grain chest in front of the back door, and filled 3 saucers with sand to set beneath the window latches. If a shutter moved, the sand would spill. It was the kind of defense a person devised when there was no second pair of hands. At sunset, she ate cornmeal toasted dry in a skillet. The kernels popped against the iron and smelled faintly sweet before burning. She chewed each mouthful with a sip no larger than a thimbleful. The tin cup from Dry Creek sat on the mantel. She had tried to forget the chained man, not because she regretted helping him, but because memory had become an indulgence. Yet in the weeks of drought she sometimes saw his stillness when she closed her eyes. She remembered the way he had refused to give Pike the satisfaction of a plea. Mara set the plate aside and darkened the cabin. The night came without moonlight. Heat remained trapped in the logs. The floorboards popped as they cooled, and each sound turned her head. She sat beside the front window with the rifle across her knees. Hours passed. A warm wind moved through the cornstalks. A loose hinge tapped once, paused, then tapped again. Somewhere near the orchard, a horse blew through its nostrils. Mara lifted the rifle. Then the smell reached her, rotten meat. She slid from the chair and moved to the shutter. Through a narrow gap, she saw 2 dark shapes near the well. Gentry dragged a leaking burlap sack from his saddle. Rourke carried a wrench. Quiet, Rourke whispered. It's fouled through, Gentry said. My coat's ruined. Your coat can be washed. Once this goes down the pipe, her deed is worthless. Mara rested the barrel on the sill. 40 yards, poor light. Rourke stood in profile, working at the iron cap. She could aim for his chest. Gentry would draw. She might work the lever fast enough. She might not. Her finger settled against the trigger. She had killed coyotes in the hen yard, rattlesnakes under the porch, and a mare with a shattered leg. Never a man. She thought of the sound the body would make when it struck the stone rim. She thought of the law calling the raid a misunderstanding and her shot murder. Rourke loosened the first bolt. His horse screamed. The roan reared so violently that the reins snapped free from the fence. Gentry's gelding jerked backward and bolted after it. The 2 men spun toward the orchard. A figure separated from the dark beneath the dead apple trees. Taza came out from beneath the trees. He wore moccasins, dark trousers, and a hide strap across his chest. No rifle hung from his shoulder. The old scars along his ribs caught the faint starlight. Gentry reached for his gun. Taza crossed the space before the weapon cleared leather. He caught Gentry's wrist, turned it outward, and drove the deputy against the well stones. The revolver fell. With his free hand, Taza shoved the burlap sack back into Gentry's arms. The seam split. Black fluid and spoiled offal spilled down the deputy's shirt. Gentry gagged and stumbled into the dust. Rourke drew halfway, saw Taza between him and the cabin, and stopped. Taza did not threaten him. He did not need to. He stood beside the well with his hands empty and his weight balanced, watching Rourke with the patience of stone. Get up, Rourke said to Gentry. The deputy left his revolver where it lay. They backed away, turned, and ran toward the ridge on foot. Taza did not follow. Mara stayed behind the shutter with the rifle at her shoulder until their footsteps faded. Only then did she lower the barrel. Her knees weakened. She sat on the floor and pressed one hand over her mouth to keep her breath quiet. Outside, Taza lifted the torn sack and carried it toward the dry ravine west of the house. He returned. unloaded Gentry's revolver, and placed the empty weapon on the fence rail. Then he walked the perimeter once, pausing at the eastern rise to listen. When he was satisfied, he looked toward the shutter. He could not see her in the dark, but he knew where she stood. Mara opened the door. She carried the last of the toasted cornmeal on a tin plate and a gourd with 3 swallows of boiled water. The porch boards creaked under her boots. Taza stopped near the orchard. He did not approach. "They are gone," he said. His voice was the same as she remembered. Low, spare, without performance. "I know." She looked toward the well. "You followed them. I saw them take the sack from Rourke's slaughter pit. I knew where they would bring it. How? The day you gave me water, I watched your wagon leave town. There are not many gray wagons with a broken left wheel brace." Mara almost smiled. "I keep meaning to replace it. It still holds. So far." She held out the plate and gourd. "This is what I have." He took the plate carefully. His fingers did not touch her injured hands. He ate half the cornmeal, drank 1 swallow, and returned the rest. "You need it," she said. "So do you." She accepted the plate. For a while they stood in the dry yard listening to the wind pass through the orchard. "You remembered," Mara said. Taza looked at the dented cup hanging from her fingers. "You walked into a circle that wanted you afraid," he said. "A man remembers the face of the person who does that." She glanced toward the cabin. The open doorway was a black rectangle behind her. Inviting a man inside would have been difficult, even if he had not been nearly a stranger. The last stranger she had let cross her threshold had been a tax collector who spent more time examining the rooms than the receipt book. "You can sleep by the hearth," she said, the door bars from within. Taza saw the tension in her shoulders. "A house has 1 door," he said. "The orchard has many. The ground is hard. The ground does not lie." He spread a woven blanket beneath the largest tree. Mara went inside. She closed the door but left the iron bar leaning against the wall. For the first time in months, she slept until dawn. At first light, Mara found Taza crouched beside the garden, with his fingers pressed into one of the cracks in the earth. The air was already warm. Dawn had barely cleared the ridge, yet the stones around the cabin held yesterday's heat. A thin white crust of alkali marked the places where water had evaporated from the soil. Mara stepped from the porch, carrying 2 cups of chicory, boiled so weak that the liquid was almost clear. Taza accepted one and set it beside him without drinking. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "The way the ground broke." "It broke because it is dry." "Yes," he traced a fissure with 1 finger. "But not all dry ground breaks the same." Mara crouched, careful of her stiff knees. "My father drilled here because the basin is level. He drilled where the work was easiest to bring home. He spent 4 months driving pipe through rock. Nothing about it was easy." Taza glanced up. There was no insult in his expression. "I did not say he was lazy." Mara sat back on her heels. The correction was quiet enough to make her hear her own defensiveness. She picked a dry clod from the row and crushed it between her fingers. It became powder. Taza looked west toward the canyon wall. "The old water does not stay beneath the flat ground when the heat lasts this long. It follows cracks in the stone. Your well reached 1 chamber. That chamber is emptying. You think there is another. I know there are veins in the western gorge. Because your people use them? Because deer use them. Creosote uses them. Cottonwood roots use them." People noticed after. Mara lifted her cup. The chicory smelled burnt and bitter. "How far?" 3 miles to the first shaded cut. Her palms throbbed at the thought of climbing. She looked at the muddy bucket beside the failed pump, then at the dead leaves in the garden. "Show me." They left before the sun rose high. Mara carried a canvas roll containing a hammer, 2 short chisels, a coil of rope, and a heel of hard bread. Taza carried a small clay water bottle and a digging stick polished by years of use. He set the pace without comment. When the slope steepened, he shortened his steps. When she paused to breathe, he stopped to examine the rock rather than stand watching her struggle. The western gorge narrowed until the sky became a bright strip overhead. The sandstone walls gave off a mineral smell, hot and faintly metallic. Lizards vanished into seams as they passed. Their footfalls disturbed no birds. After an hour, Taza stopped beside a slanted shelf of stone that cast a deep patch of shade. A cluster of creosote grew at its base. Most of the shrubs on the valley floor had curled brown leaves, but these held a dull green sheen. Mara touched one. The leaf bent without breaking. Taza handed her a thin willow fork. She frowned. "My father called that superstition." "What did your father call the moon pulling water in a well?" "He called it pressure." Taza's mouth shifted slightly at one corner. It might have been amusement. He took the fork back and held the branches in both hands. He moved along the base of the wall, watching the ground, the shrubs, and the little places where insects had burrowed. The willow dipped near the overhang. Mara watched his wrists. You turned it. No, do it again. Step up, reset his hands, and crossed the spot a second time. The fork lowered. Mara did not understand it, but understanding could wait. She knelt and drove one of the chisels into the gravel. The upper layer came loose in hot, pale flakes. Beneath it lay dense clay. They worked side by side, Taza breaking the hard pan with the ironwood stick, while Mara scraped the loosened pieces away with a flat shard of slate. The cuts in her palms opened before they reached a foot. She wrapped them with strips torn from her underskirt and continued. By noon the gorge had become an oven, though the overhang kept direct light off their backs. Sweat ran into Mara's eyes. The bread in her mouth turned to paste she could barely swallow. Taza gave her the clay bottle. She took one sip and handed it back. More, he said. There will be less later. There will be none later if you fall now. She took another. They dug until Mara's slate struck soil that did not ring. The color below the clay was darker. She leaned close and smelled it, wet earth. For a moment she remained still, afraid movement would break whatever fragile truth lay under her hands. Taza pressed his palm into the dark layer. Moisture gathered around his fingers. Not a gush, not even a trickle, only a clear bead rising from the soil and joining another. Mara pushed her fingers into the mud. Cold seeped through the torn cloth around her palms. She closed her eyes. The relief was so sudden that it hurt. It is slow, Taza said, but the stone protects it. The sun cannot drink it here. Mara opened her eyes and looked downhill toward the distant shape of her cabin. The grade falls east. Yes, if we cut a channel around the shoulder of the ridge, gravity will carry it. If the walls are sealed, clay first, river stone at the bends. Taza nodded, then we build. They worked until dusk. The first trench was no wider than Mara's hand. Water followed it hesitantly, darkening the dust in a thin line. Where the ground rose, Taza broke stone. Where the soil crumbled, Mara packed wet clay against the sides and smoothed it with the slate. They returned to the cabin after dark with less than 100 yards completed. Mara's legs shook on the porch steps. Taza went to the well, drew the last usable water from the reserve barrel, and poured it into a basin without asking. Mara sat on the step while he set the basin near her boots. For your hands, he said, I can use sand. Sand will stay in the cuts. She lowered her hands into the water. The sting made her inhale sharply. Taza turned away and began repairing the broken wheel brace on her wagon. He found a piece of ash wood in the shed, shaved it with his knife, and fitted it beside the cracked support. The rasp of his blade against wood was steady and unhurried. Mara washed the clay and blood from her fingers. You do not have to repair that. It still holds, he said. She heard the echo of their conversation from the night before. So far, she replied. For supper she boiled beans with a strip of salt pork she had been saving for winter. The steam fogged the nearest window, the cabin filled with the smell of smoke, onion, and fat. Taza remained on the porch until she carried a second bowl outside. You may come in, Mara said. He looked at the doorway, then at her. I am not asking because I owe you, she added. I am asking because the beans will cool. He entered. The cabin seemed smaller with him inside. Taza removed his knife and placed it on the floor beside the wall before sitting at the table. The gesture loosened something in Mara's chest. They ate in silence at first. A moth struck the lantern glass. The spoon scraped the bottom of Mara's bowl. Wind pushed ash smell from the hearth into the room. You knew Rourke's men would use the well law, she said. I heard them in town. When? After the judge freed me. Pike and Gentry argued behind the livery. They said a poisoned source could be condemned. You stayed in Dry Creek? Long enough to learn why they had chained me. Mara waited. Taza ate another spoonful before speaking. Rourke's riders had moved boundary stones near the northern spring. I moved them back. That was the trespass. That was the insult. Why did the stones matter to you? The spring is used by families west of the ridge. Rourke wanted his cattle there. If the town accepted the new line, the families would have to ask him for water. Mara understood. It was the same method applied to different people. Change a mark, create a debt, call theft paperwork. Pendleton asked whether you wanted to file a complaint, she said. You refused. A complaint would have kept me in their town for weeks. The spring needed watching, and now my land needs watching. Taza met her gaze. For a time, the answer should have relieved her. Instead, she noticed how the room would feel when his steady presence was gone. The next morning he gave her a hand tool. He had carved it during the night from a root of desert ironwood. The blade was short and broad, shaped for packing clay. The handle curved slightly to fit the angle of her grip. 2 shallow grooves matched the first joints of her fingers. Mara turned it over. "You measured my hand. I watched how you held the slate. That slate was free. It was also cutting you." She looked at the clean wooden edge, then at him. Gifts in Dry Creek always arrived with a hook hidden inside them. This one asked nothing except that she use it. "Thank you," she said. Taza dipped his chin. They returned to the gorge. For 6 days they cut the channel. Their work fell into a rhythm that required little speech. Taza broke the ground. Mara shaped it. He hauled stone from the wash. She fitted each piece into the turns and sealed the gaps with clay. At noon they rested under the overhang and divided bread, beans, and water exactly in half. Mara learned that Taza disliked coffee but drank it when offered. He learned she counted under her breath while laying stones. She learned he could mend rawhide with an awl made from bone. He learned she kept a nail keg beneath the wagon because the shed roof leaked. Nothing about the knowledge was grand. That was why it mattered. On the 3rd evening, clouds rose in the north and dissolved before reaching the basin. Mara watched them vanish while stirring a pot of corn mush. "I used to think the land punished people," she said. Taza sat by the hearth sharpening his knife on a river stone. "The land does not know punishment. It takes without caring. It gives without caring too. That is not comforting. It is not meant to be." She smiled despite herself. On the 5th day the trench reached the lower pasture. A thin stream followed them, moving through the new channel with a quiet sound like cloth being torn far away. Mara knelt at each joint, searching for leaks. When she found one, she packed clay with the ironwood trowel until the water rose and continued. At sunset, the first clear trickle entered the garden ditch. Mara had prepared the ditch that morning, scraping away dead roots and forming shallow basins around the surviving corn. Water touched the first plant, circled its stalk, and disappeared into the earth. The soil darkened. Neither she nor Taza spoke. A meadowlark landed on the fence, tilted its head toward the channel, and flew down to drink. Mara sat in the dirt. Her dress was stiff with clay from hem to waist. Her hands were bandaged. A blister had formed under one heel. She began to laugh. It was not a graceful sound. It came out rough and surprised, then caught in her throat. Taza looked at her. "I thought I had forgotten how," she said. His face softened. The bird remembered first. She laughed again. They widened the final section before dark and built a small gate from cedar scraps so Mara could direct the flow between the garden and storage trough. The spring would not support Rourke's herds. It would not fill a reservoir, but it could keep 2 people, a small garden, and a few animals alive. That night, Mara baked the last of her wheat flour into biscuits. She used more lard than her ledger allowed. Taza noticed the open book beside the mixing bowl. "You crossed out a number," he said. "I revised it. For biscuits. For victory." He accepted this without argument. The next afternoon, riders appeared on the eastern road. This time there were 3. Rourke rode in front. Gentry followed. Between them came Edwin Sterling, the Dry Creek clerk, sweating through a linen coat and clutching a document tube against his chest. Mara was sealing a bend in the canal when the hoofbeats reached her. She stood, wiped clay from her palms, and took the rifle from the porch. Taza remained beside the ditch with the ironwood digging stick in one hand. The riders stopped at the property line. Rourke's eyes went first to the moving water. His surprise lasted less than a second, but Mara saw it. Sterling unrolled a paper and read in a voice too loud for the empty basin. "Mara Ellison, by order of the Municipal Court of Dry Creek, this property is declared subject to immediate repossession due to unpaid tax obligations and a corrected boundary survey establishing prior claim by Caleb Rourke." "My taxes were delivered," Mara said. Sterling licked his lips. "The ledger shows otherwise. Your ledger, the official ledger." Gentry smiled. "You have until sunset to clear the cabin." Mara raised the rifle slightly. "No." Rourke leaned forward in his saddle. "You can shoot one of us, perhaps 2 if the deputy fumbles. Then the town hangs you and takes the land anyway." The words were calm because he believed them. Mara knew he was right. Her finger rested outside the trigger guard. The rifle suddenly felt like a piece of farm equipment brought to a courtroom. Taza stepped between her and the riders, not blocking her weapon, only breaking Rourke's line of sight. "A lie does not become older because a clerk reads it aloud," he said. Sterling looked at Rourke. "Mr. Rourke, you said the original grant had never been filed with the territory. It wasn't. Taza's gaze remained on the clerk. Municipal paper cannot erase a federal covenant. Gentry laughed. What would you know about a federal covenant? More than a deputy who poisons wells. Gentry's face went pale beneath the sunburn. Rourke's hand settled near his revolver. She has no federal document. Then you can wait while she looks, Taza said. This order is effective now. Sterling sounded less certain. Mara lowered the rifle. When does Judge Pendleton arrive? Sterling's eyes flicked away. Rourke answered too quickly. He is not due for another month. Mara saw it then, the clerk's nervous horse, the sweat beneath his collar, the rush to serve an order at the hottest hour of the day. They did not want her gone before night. They wanted her gone before the circuit court opened in the morning. Pendleton is in Dry Creek, she said. No one replied. Rourke's silence confirmed it. Mara looked back at the cabin. Her father had distrusted banks, registries, and men who smiled while weighing another person's land. He had kept receipts in flour tins and ammunition beneath loose floorboards. If a federal grant existed, he would not have left it in town. The cellar, she said. She turned to Taza. Give me 1 hour, Rourke laughed. At sunset, I come down with men enough to carry you out. 1 hour, Mara repeated. The riders withdrew to the eastern rise, where they remained as dark shapes against the bright sky. Inside the cabin, Mara lifted the trapdoor beneath the rag rug. Damp air rose from below, carrying the smell of earth, old apples, and mildew. She had not entered the root cellar since her father's burial. Taza lit the kerosene lantern and went down first, checking the ladder rungs. Mara followed. 3 trunks stood against the back wall. The first held ledgers, rusted survey tools, winter coats eaten by mice, and a brass compass with a cracked face. Mara opened every book, shook every coat, and ran her fingers along the lining of the trunk. Nothing. The second contained her mother's daguerreotype, a pocket watch, letters tied with blue thread, and a child's knitted cap Mara did not remember wearing. She pushed the objects aside with growing desperation. Nothing. The final trunk was smaller and bound with iron straps. Its padlock had rusted into a single brown lump. Taza broke it with the back of his knife. Inside they found a disassembled revolver coated in grease, coils of copper wire, a spare pump gear, and packets of seed wrapped in rawhide. Mara opened one. Red and yellow corn kernels rolled into her palm. Her father had prepared for drought. He had prepared for broken machinery and attack. But there was no grant. Mara searched the corners until her nails split. The lantern hissed. Dust floated through the yellow light. Above them, faint through timber and earth, a horse stamped on the road. She sat back on her heels. I was wrong. Taza said nothing. I thought work would be enough. Pay what they ask. Mend what breaks. Keep to myself. Her voice sounded small in the cellar. I thought if I gave them no reason, they would leave me alone. Taza lowered the lantern near the trunk. They do not need a reason, he said. Mara pressed both palms against the bare boards at the bottom. There is nothing here. Taza crouched and tapped one knuckle against the wood. The sound was hollow. Mara looked up. He tapped again, farther to the left. Solid, back at the center, hollow. They searched the edges. Beneath a smear of old grease, Mara found a recessed loop of wire. She pulled. The false bottom lifted half an inch and caught. Taza slid his knife into the seam and levered carefully until the panel rose. A flat saddle leather portfolio lay beneath it, wrapped in waxed cord. Mara's hands shook so badly she could not untie the knot. Taza held the lantern while she worked it loose one strand at a time. Inside the portfolio was a sheet of thick vellum folded around a smaller map. The territorial seal remained unbroken, dark red against the cream-colored paper. Mara unfolded the grant. Her father's name appeared near the top. Beneath it, in formal script, the document described the cabin tract, the deep well, the western gorge, and the spring crites extending through the canyon. It had been signed 15 years before Dry Creek formed a council. At the bottom, beside the governor's seal, was a mark drawn in brown-black ink, a hawk descending over 3 lines of water. Taza leaned closer. For the first time since Mara had known him, his stillness changed. Not broken, deepened. My grandfather made that mark, he said. Mara looked from the symbol to his face. Taza touched 2 fingers to the air above the vellum without laying them on it. Your father and my grandfather made the spring covenant, he said. The land could be worked by Ellison hands, but the western water would remain open to the families of the canyon. Neither side could sell it without the other. Mara read the lines again. The legal language had hidden the meaning in boundaries and rites of passage, but it was there. Her father had not claimed the land alone. He had promised to keep it from men like Rourke. Above them, the evening wind pushed dust against the cabin wall. Mara folded the grant along its old creases and slid it into the portfolio. "How much time?" she asked. Taza looked toward the cellar ceiling, listening. "The last light has reached the canyon edge." Mara stood. "Then we will show them what was here before their town." They climbed from the cellar, carrying the lantern and the portfolio. The cabin had filled with amber evening light. Through the west window, the canyon rim burned red. Mara placed the grant on the table long enough to wash the cellar dirt from her face and bind her palms with clean cloth. She changed her torn apron but kept the mud-stiff dress. There was no time for appearances, and she had no desire to meet Rourke dressed as though she were asking his permission. Taza stood near the door, listening to the riders above the property. His knife remained sheathed. He had taken the repeating rifle from the table, checked the chamber, and set it back within Mara's reach. "You expected the paper," she said. "I expected your father to have protected the work. You never met him. My grandfather spoke of a white man who came to the council fire carrying no rifle." Mara tightened the cord around the portfolio. "That sounds unlike him. He carried a rifle to the privy." Taza glanced at her. She saw the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps he left it with the horses," Taza said. Mara slipped the portfolio beneath her arm. "That sounds more likely." They stepped onto the porch as the sun touched the western stone. Rourke and his companions came down from the rise. 2 more riders had joined them, ranch hands Mara recognized from town. They spread across the road, not close enough to cross the legal boundary, but close enough to make the threat clear. Sterling held the eviction order in both hands. Gentry had found another revolver. Rourke stopped his horse at the dead squash row. Time. Mara walked to the porch edge and opened the portfolio. The vellum caught the last light. The dark wax seal shone. Sterling sucked in a breath. Rourke looked at him. "What?" The clerk's face had gone the color of flour. "That appears to be a territorial grant." "It appears to be whatever she wants it to be." Mara unfolded the page fully. "It names the Ellison tract from the eastern ridge to the western gorge. It grants the deep aquifer and spring access under federal authority. It predates Dry Creek by 15 years. Rourke dismounted. Taza stepped down from the porch. The movement was not dramatic. He simply placed himself on the ground between Rourke and Mara. The rancher stopped. "Let me see it," Rourke said. "You may see it in Judge Pendleton's courtroom. The judge leaves at noon tomorrow." Sterling's words escaped before he could stop them. Rourke turned on him with such rage that the clerk pulled his mare backward. Mara folded the grant. "You meant to have me removed tonight so the property would appear abandoned when he opened court. No judge will accept a paper found in a cellar after 20 years. He will accept the seal. Seals can be copied." Taza spoke from beside her. "Can your clerk copy the mark of the descending hawk?" Rourke's eyes moved to him. For 1 second, fear showed plainly in the rancher's face. Not fear of Taza's strength, fear of a history he could not alter with a municipal pen. "What mark?" Gentry asked. Rourke ignored him. Mara understood that he had known some version of the covenant existed. Perhaps he had found a reference in a survey book. Perhaps that was why he had moved so quickly and paid so much to control Sterling. The drought had not merely created opportunity. It had created a deadline. Once Pendleton saw the old grant, Rourke's claim would die. "You knew," Mara said. Rourke's face hardened. "I knew your father made agreements no sensible man would honor now. This basin cannot survive with water divided among garden plots and wandering camps. It needs management, by you, by someone capable of using it." Mara looked toward the narrow ribbon moving through the new canal. A quail drank near the gate. Beyond the western ridge, families Taza had spoken and depended on springs Rourke wanted to fence. "You call taking everything management," she said. "I call it surviving. So do I." Rourke looked at the ranch hands behind him. Neither moved. The federal seal had changed the nature of the night. Men willing to frighten a woman from her home were less willing to attack a documented federal claimant in front of witnesses. Rourke mounted again. "This is not finished." "It will be tomorrow," Mara said. He wheeled the roan and rode east. Gentry followed, then the ranch hands. Sterling lingered long enough to look at Mara with an expression that was part plea and part calculation. "I only entered what was brought to me," he said. "You entered what you were paid to enter. I have a family. So did the people you helped remove." Sterling lowered his eyes and rode after Rourke. Darkness settled over the homestead. Mara placed the grant on the table and covered it with an oilcloth. She checked the seams twice. then wrapped the whole portfolio inside a flour sack to keep dust from the wax. Taza went to harness the wagon team. Mara joined him with a lantern. The horses were thin from drought but sound. She brushed grit from their backs, checked each hoof, and added a little extra grain to the feed pans. "We leave before dawn," she said. "Rourke may wait on the road." "He will. We can take the old wash north of the ridge. The wagon will lose a wheel, the braces repaired." Mara looked at him. "That is a great deal of confidence in a piece of ash wood. It still holds. So far." The familiar exchange steadied her. They slept in shifts. Mara took the first watch beside the window while Taza rested on the floor near the hearth, his blanket folded beneath one shoulder. At midnight they changed places. Mara lay on the cot fully dressed. The cabin was quiet except for the rasp of crickets that had returned near the damp canal. She watched the fire shrink to red coals. She had spent years believing safety meant a barred door, a loaded rifle, and no one close enough to disappoint her. Yet the iron bar still leaned unused against the wall. Taza sat between the door and the window without claiming the room, without asking what his protection earned him. She fell asleep to the soft scrape of his knife against a sharpening stone. Before sunrise, they loaded the wagon. The portfolio went into a wooden bread box lined with cloth and tucked beneath the seat. Mara packed water, cornmeal cakes, a jar of beans, a spare wheel pin, rope, a shovel, and cartridges. Taza walked the first mile beside the team, watching the road ahead. They did not take the main route. At the dry wash, Mara guided the horses down a steep bank. The wagon leaned so far that the right wheels lifted. Taza put one shoulder against the sideboard and held it steady until the wheels settled again. Dust poured around his boots. They moved north through low country, hidden from the eastern ridge. The sun rose behind them, throwing long shadows ahead of the team. Jackrabbits scattered through brittle grass. Far off, a coyote stood on a mound and watched them pass. Near the narrows, Taza raised one hand. Mara stopped the wagon. Fresh hoofprints crossed the wash. 4 horses, iron shoes, traveling west less than an hour earlier. "Rourke's men?" she asked. "Likely. Waiting on the main road." Taza nodded. They continued north until the wash joined a stony cattle trail that entered Dry Creek behind the cemetery. By then the town bell had rung 8 times. Smoke from breakfast fires hung over the rooftops. The bakery smelled of yeast and scorched sugar. A freight wagon blocked half the alley beside the church, and children carrying slates stopped to stare at Taza walking beside Mara's wagon. People recognized them. Word moved faster than the horses. By the time Mara turned onto the main street, shopkeepers stood in their doorways. The punishment post remained in the square, sun-cracked and empty. Taza passed it without looking. Mara looked for him instead. His face did not change, but his left hand opened and closed once at his side. She slowed the team. "We can go behind the hotel," she said quietly. No, it was not pride. It was refusal to let the town choose his path again. They continued down the center of the street. The circuit court occupied the second floor of the municipal building. Every window stood open, though no breeze entered. Wagons crowded the hitching rail. Rourke's roan was tied near the steps, along with Gentry's gelding and Sterling's gray mare. Mara set the brake. Taza reached beneath the seat and lifted out the bread box. He handed it to her. The weight of the grant seemed greater now than it had in the cellar. "You carried water 30 yards through a crowd." Taza said, "This is only 12 steps." Mara looked at the courthouse entrance. "No," she said. "It is more than 12, yes." He waited. Mara tucked the box beneath one arm and climbed the steps. The courtroom was already full. Ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder on the benches. Town merchants stood against the walls. Women fanned themselves with folded newspapers. Judge Pendleton sat behind the high desk with his coat buttoned and a stack of filings beside his right hand. Rourke stood before him, speaking in a measured tone. "The claimant has abandoned productive use. Your Honor, the municipal court acted to preserve the only viable water source for the economic survival of the basin." Gentry stood near the railing with his badge polished. Sterling arranged papers on the clerk's table. Without looking toward the door, Mara entered. The room quieted in a wave from back to front. Rourke turned. His confidence broke for half a second when he saw the bread box. Then Taza stepped through the doorway behind her. Gentry reached for his revolver. "Deputy," Judge Pendleton said without raising his voice, "if your hand closes on that weapon in my courtroom, you will spend the remainder of this circuit in irons." Gentry froze. Pendleton adjusted his spectacles and studied Mara. Recognition came slowly, followed by memory. His gaze shifted to Taza and remained there a moment longer. "I remember both of you," he said. Rourke lifted the eviction writ. "Your Honor, Miss Ellison is in violation of a lawful order. This man is trespassing and has assaulted a deputy." Pendleton looked at Gentry's clean coat, then at Taza's empty hands. "We will address each allegation in order." Miss Ellison approached. Mara crossed the room. The 12 steps from the door to the railing felt longer than the distance across the old town square. She heard boots shift behind her. She smelled ink, sweat, dust, and furniture polish. She kept both hands around the bread box. At the bench, she lifted the lid and removed the oilcloth bundle. Rourke began speaking. "The paper she carries has no verified chain of custody." Pendleton held up one finger. Rourke stopped. Mara unwrapped the portfolio, untied the waxed cord, and opened the vellum beneath the judge's lamp. The red seal caught the light. Pendleton leaned forward. No one in the room moved. Pendleton did not touch the page at once. He bent close enough to inspect the seal, then opened a drawer and removed a small magnifying lens. The courtroom waited while he examined the wax, the ribbon pressed beneath it, and the ink where the governor's signature crossed the fold. Sterling's breathing grew loud in the silence. "Where was this document kept?" Pendleton asked. "In a false-bottom trunk beneath my cabin," Mara said. "Who found the compartment?" He heard the hollow space. She glanced toward Taza. "We opened it together." Rourke gave a short laugh. "Convenient." Pendleton looked over his spectacles. "Mr. Rourke? Convenience is not a legal objection." He unfolded the attached map. His finger followed the eastern ridge, the cabin tract, and the western spring corridor. Then he reached the mark beside the seal, the descending hawk. Pendleton's expression changed. He looked at Taza. "Come forward." A murmur moved through the benches. Taza crossed the room. People leaned away from him as they had in the square months earlier, but no one laughed now. Pendleton turned the vellum so the mark faced him. "Do you recognize this?" Taza studied the symbol. "It belonged to my grandfather, Taza Tallwater." "Under what authority did he place it on a federal grant?" He spoke for the Canyon families at the Spring Council. The soldiers wanted a road through the western cut. Samuel Ellison wanted land for a well and cabin. My grandfather agreed if the spring passage stayed open and no single owner closed the water. Pendleton read the dense clause beneath the map again. "And this mark records tribal assent to that covenant?" "Yes." Rourke stepped closer to the railing. "Your Honor, oral recollection cannot supersede a modern survey." Pendleton looked at him. "No. But an original federal grant bearing a territorial seal and a countersign recognized by a surviving party to the treaty can." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Surviving party?" He was not there. "Neither were you when your surveyor invented a new boundary line." A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone coughed into a handkerchief. Pendleton placed the lens on the desk and sat back. "This court will hear how a municipal tax balance appeared after payment, why an emergency eviction was issued less than 24 hours before my arrival, and why the deputy named in that order was seen attempting to contaminate the disputed well." Gentry's head snapped toward Rourke. Sterling gripped the edge of the clerk's table. Pendleton picked up his gavel, though he did not strike it. "Lock the doors," he told the bailiff. "No one involved in this matter leaves, until the record is complete." The bailiff crossed the room. The heavy oak doors shut behind the last row of benches. The bolt slid into place. Judge Pendleton set the gavel down and asked the bailiff to bring him the municipal tax ledger. Edwin Sterling did not move. "Mr. Sterling," Pendleton said, "the book." The clerk swallowed, bent beneath his table, and lifted a wide volume bound in green cloth. He carried it to the bench with both arms. Sweat had soaked the back of his linen coat from collar to waist. Pendleton opened the ledger to the Ellison account. The page showed 3 years of entries in Sterling's narrow hand. Tax due, tax paid, tax due, tax paid. The final line carried a balance in red ink and a notation that no payment had been received by the deadline. Mara reached into the inner pocket of her dress and removed the receipt she had folded there before leaving the cabin. The paper was soft at the creases from being handled too often. "I paid on the 3rd of June, she said. Sterling shook his head. "That receipt could have been written at any time. It carries your stamp. Stamps can be taken." Pendleton held out his hand. Mara gave him the receipt. The judge examined the purple municipal mark, then turned the paper over. "There is a serial number." Sterling went still. Pendleton looked to the bailiff. "Bring the receipt stub book." The bailiff disappeared through a side door. While they waited, the judge read the eviction order from beginning to end. His expression did not change, but the room seemed to grow hotter with every page. Rourke stood at the railing with one hand resting on the polished wood. "Your Honor, the tax matter is separate from the boundary correction. Even if payment was made, the new survey establishes. The survey will have its turn. The basin is in crisis. My herds supply beef to Fort Grant, Dry Creek, and 3 mining camps. I acted to preserve a resource essential to the territory." Pendleton glanced toward the courtroom windows. "Did the territorial government appoint you steward of all water in the basin?" "No, but practical necessity. Practical necessity is the phrase powerful men use when the law delays them." Rourke's face tightened, but he held his tongue. The bailiff returned with a narrow book of duplicate receipts. Pendleton compared Mara's paper to the stub bearing the same serial number. The stub recorded her payment in full. A line had been drawn through it. Above the line, in darker ink, someone had written void. Pendleton touched the 2 inks with the point of a penknife. The cancellation was entered later. Sterling stared at the floor. "Who voided it?" "I do not recall. You are the sole municipal clerk. My assistant sometimes. You have no assistant." A quiet sound moved through the gallery. It was not laughter exactly, but it had the same effect on Sterling. His shoulders folded inward. Pendleton continued. "When was the corrected survey filed?" "Yesterday morning." "Who conducted it?" "Mr. Hollis Vale." "Where is Mr. Vale?" Sterling looked at Rourke. Rourke answered. "He rode south on business." "Convenient," Mara said. Pendleton's gaze flicked toward her. For an instant, she thought she saw dry amusement. "Indeed," he said. He asked for the survey. Sterling brought it forward. Pendleton spread the map beside the federal grant. The new boundary was drawn in a broad blue line that cut through Mara's garden, passed directly over the deep pump, and ended at the western gorge. Taza stood beside the railing, silent. Pendleton measured the line against the coordinates on the grant. "This survey places the eastern ridge almost half a mile west of its location on the territorial map." Rourke said, "The old map was imprecise. The ridge is granite. Has it moved?" A man near the back of the room coughed to hide a laugh. Rourke turned toward him, and the sound died. Pendleton laid the documents flat. "Mr. Sterling, who instructed you to record this map?" "The municipal judge approved it." "Who brought it to the judge?" "I do not remember." "You have forgotten a great deal since breakfast." Sterling's fingers tightened around the edge of his table. Pendleton shifted his attention to Gentry. "Deputy, step forward." Gentry obeyed with visible reluctance. "Did you accompany Mr. Rourke to the Ellison property yesterday morning?" "Yes, to serve notice of the dispute." "Did you return after dark?" "No." Mara heard the lie settle in the room. Pendleton looked at Taza. "Mr. Tallwater, you may speak." Taza's voice carried without effort. "They came after midnight. They wrapped cloth around their horses' hooves." The deputy carried a sack from Rourke's slaughter pit. Mr. Rourke opened the well cap. Gentry turned. "That is a lie." Taza looked at him. "Your right wrist is swollen where I took the gun." Every eye in the room dropped to Gentry's hand. The deputy had wrapped the wrist beneath his sleeve, but the fingers were puffy and purple at the base. "I fell from my horse. Your horse ran before you did." A few people laughed openly this time. Gentry's face darkened. "He attacked a law officer." "While you were performing what lawful duty?" Pendleton asked. Gentry looked to Rourke. The rancher stared straight ahead. Pendleton waited. Silence was one of the few tools he used as effectively as Taza. He let it lengthen until Gentry's breathing became uneven. "I was inspecting the source," the deputy said. "At midnight. Due to a complaint. From whom?" "Mr. Rourke." "What contamination had he reported before you arrived with a sack of carrion?" Gentry's mouth opened. No sound came. The judge turned to Mara. "Did you see the sack?" "Yes." "What became of it?" "Taza carried it to the dry ravine." "Was the well contaminated?" "No." "Was a weapon discharged?" "No." "Did Mr. Tallwater pursue the men after they withdrew?" "No." Pendleton looked at Taza. "Why not?" "The well was the danger. Once it was safe, there was no reason to chase frightened men through dark country." Gentry flinched at the word frightened. Pendleton folded his hands. "Mr. Rourke, did you order your employee to contaminate the well?" Rourke's voice remained controlled. "I did not. Were you present?" "No." Mara stared at him. He did not look her way. Taza spoke. He held the wrench. Rourke turned sharply. "Your word against mine?" "No," Pendleton said. "At present it is your word against 2 witnesses. A deputy with an injured wrist, a clerk who altered a tax record, and an eviction order rushed through before this court could examine an original grant." He looked down at the papers. "The arithmetic is poor for you, Mr. Rourke." Rourke's composure thinned. You cannot build a judgment on the testimony of an Apache and a woman who stands to keep valuable land. The courtroom changed. The words were not unusual in Dry Creek. That was why they struck so clearly. Rourke had spoken the assumption beneath the whole scheme, that Taza's truth counted less and Mara's ownership remained conditional. Pendleton removed his spectacles. "When I entered this town 6 months ago," he said, "I found Mr. Tallwater chained to a post without charge while Deputy Gentry watched. Miss Ellison was the only person in the square who acted as though his life had legal value. That does not prove the claims before me today. It does, however, tell me which parties have established a pattern of conduct." He put the spectacles back on. "Your wealth is not testimony, Mr. Rourke. Your race is not testimony. Your sex is not testimony. Evidence is testimony." Rourke's nostrils flared. Pendleton turned to Sterling. "Did Mr. Rourke pay you to void the Ellison receipt?" Sterling shook his head too quickly. "Did he promise to clear your debt at the bank?" The clerk's eyes rose. Rourke moved. "Do not answer questions based on speculation." Pendleton struck the gavel once. The crack stopped every whisper in the room. "You are not counsel, Mr. Rourke. Sit." Rourke remained standing. The bailiff stepped closer. Slowly, Rourke sat at the nearest table. Pendleton addressed Sterling again. "Your banknote is a public filing. It was purchased by the Rourke Cattle Company in May. 2 days later, Miss Ellison's tax receipt was voided. Yesterday, you recorded a survey drawn by a man who cannot be located, and you issued an emergency eviction hours before my arrival. I will ask once more. What were you promised?" Sterling's face crumpled in stages. First the jaw loosened, then the eyes closed, then his shoulders sagged as if the linen coat had become too heavy. "He said he would forgive the note," Sterling whispered. Rourke stood again. "Edwin." The clerk recoiled from his name. Pendleton raised one hand toward the bailiff. Rourke sat. Sterling gripped the table. "My youngest had fever in the spring. The doctor came 3 times. I borrowed against the house. Mr. Rourke bought the note. He said the Ellison woman would lose the property anyway when the well failed. He said changing the entry would only move matters sooner." Mara listened without satisfaction. She had seen Sterling's youngest child outside the schoolhouse, a thin girl with yellow ribbons in her hair. Need had opened the door. Greed and cowardice had walked through it. Pendleton asked, "Who drew the survey?" "Rourke's foreman. Hollis Vale signed it, but he never rode the line." "Where is Vale?" "He left for New Mexico last night." "Who instructed the municipal judge to issue the order?" "Mr. Rourke brought him $500 and promised the town a new cattle trough." Rourke stood so abruptly that his chair fell backward. "You lying little worm." Gentry grabbed Sterling by the collar. The bailiff moved, but Taza was closer. He caught Gentry's forearm and removed it from the clerk with a turn so controlled that the deputy found himself bent over the table without understanding how he had arrived there. Taza released him at once. Gentry stumbled back, reaching again toward his revolver. Pendleton's voice sharpened. "Badge and weapon on the bench, now." Gentry stared at him. "Judd, do it." The deputy unpinned the tarnished star. His hand shook as he placed it beside the red seal. Then he removed his gun belt and laid it down. The heavy holster struck the wood with a dull thump. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Gentry for conspiracy, attempted destruction of a protected water source, and perjury before this court." The bailiff took Gentry by the arm. "You cannot do this," Gentry said. "I am the law here." "No," Pendleton replied. "You were wearing it." Gentry was led to a side room. Sterling remained at the clerk's table, weeping silently into one hand. Pendleton looked at him. "You will surrender the municipal books and remain available to the federal marshal. Your cooperation will be entered into the record. So will the harm you caused." Sterling nodded. Then the judge faced Rourke. The rancher stood alone. His coat was still clean. His silver watch chain still crossed his vest, yet the room no longer bent around him. Men who had borrowed from his bank or grazed cattle on his land avoided his eyes. Pendleton lifted the federal grant. "This instrument is valid. The Ellison Tract, Deep Aquifer, Western Gorge, and Spring Corridor are protected by territorial authority and by the covenant recorded here. The municipal survey is fraudulent. The eviction order is void. The tax balance was fabricated." He tore the eviction order in half. The sound of paper ripping was soft, but Mara felt it in her chest. Pendleton continued, "I am issuing an injunction prohibiting Caleb Rourke, his employees, cattle, and agents from entering the Ellison Tract or obstructing access to the Western Spring Corridor. Violation will result in federal seizure of assets and arrest by the territorial marshal." Copies will be lodged in Santa Fe and at Fort Grant, beyond the reach of the Dry Creek Council. Rourke's voice came out hoarse. You would cripple the largest ranch in the basin over one woman's garden. No, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. She stood beside Taza with the dented tin cup in her satchel and clay still dried beneath her nails. You crippled yourself when you decided no one else had the right to drink. Rourke stared at her. For the first time, Mara saw not a giant but a tired man who had mistaken control for permanence. The drought had frightened him. His herds were dying. His contracts were failing. He had chosen to make everyone else smaller rather than admit the land could not be mastered by ownership alone. That understanding did not excuse him. It only made him human enough to be judged. Pendleton struck the gavel. Mr. Rourke, leave my courtroom. The marshal will speak with you before you leave town. Rourke picked up his hat. No one moved aside for him at first. He had to ask a ranch hand to let him pass. When the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled. Pendleton folded the grant along its original lines and returned it to Mara. Keep this somewhere dry, he said. I thought the cellar was dry, somewhere dry that you remember. Mara allowed herself a small smile. Yes, Judge. His gaze shifted to Taza. The covenant requires open passage to the western spring. Is that access presently clear? It will be, Taza said. Rourke's boundary stones must be removed. Pendleton turned to the bailiff. Add restoration of the original markers to the order. Federal expense to be recovered from Rourke Cattle Company. He signed the injunction. The pen scratched across the page. Mara watched the ink dry. Outside the courthouse, the noon sun had turned the street white. Mara stood on the top step with the grant secured inside the bread box. For a few seconds, she could not make herself move. The town below looked exactly as it had that morning. Hitch rails, wagons, a dog asleep beneath the trough, dust trapped in the cracks of the boardwalk. Nothing visible had changed, yet the pressure she had carried for years was gone. Taza waited one step below her. People came out behind them in a loose stream. They did not crowd close. Some watched with curiosity, some with unease, and a few with the expression of people recalculating old opinions. The woman from the bakery approached Mara first. Her name was Mrs. Finch, and until that day their conversations had never gone beyond the price of yeast. I saw what you did in the square, she said. Mara knew which square and which day. Mrs. Finch twisted her apron hem. I should have done something too. Mara looked toward the empty punishment post. You can do something next time, she said. The woman nodded, eyes wet, and returned to the bakery. A stable boy brought Mara's team from the hitch rail. He was perhaps 12, all elbows in dust, with one boot patched in 2 places. Someone loosened the near trace, he said quietly. I fixed it. Mara examined the buckle. The leather had been cut almost through, then reedied to hide the damage. Had she driven down the steep wash with it weakened, the team might have broken apart on the slope. Did you see who? Taza asked. The boy shook his head. A man in a brown coat was by the wagon before court. Rourke had left the building, but his habit still moved through town. Mara gave the boy a nickel. He tried to refuse, then closed his fingers around it when she insisted. Buy new thread for that boot, she said. I was going to buy licorice. That is also a use. He grinned and ran toward the mercantile. Taza replaced the damaged trace with the spare harness Mara kept beneath the wagon seat. He worked in the shade of the courthouse steps, pulling the leather through the buckle and testing each hole. Mara watched his hands. 6 months ago, those wrists had been trapped in sun-heated iron 10 yards from where he now stood. The skin had healed into pale bands. No one in the street mentioned them. When the harness was sound, Mara went to the mercantile. Amos Pike's brother stood behind the counter. His usual smile did not appear. I need flour, salt, lamp oil, and 2 rolls of fence wire, Mara said. He named a price only slightly above fair. She waited. The merchant cleared his throat and revised it downward. Mara paid without comment. At the doorway she saw the dented tin cup hanging from her satchel. An impulse made her turn back. And a second tin cup, she said. The merchant placed one on the counter. It was new and bright, without dents or scratches. Mara held it beside the old one. The new cup looked like something from a store. The old one looked like something that had survived. She bought both. They left Dry Creek by the main road. No riders blocked the ridge. Near the north pasture, a federal marshal's wagon passed them heading toward town. 2 armed men sat in front and a third rode behind with spare horses. Taza watched until they disappeared into the dust. Pendleton works quickly. Mara said, he knows Rourke will work quickly too. Do you think he will run? No, why not? Men who build their names on owning land do not know where to go without it. The journey home took the rest of the day. Mara drove while Taza walked beside the team. At the place where the road crossed the dry wash, she stopped and held out the reins. "Ride," she said. He looked at the narrow wagon seat. "The horses are tired. You are not helping them by walking. That is not how weight works. You know what I mean." Taza climbed up. The seat had been built for one person. Their shoulders touched whenever a wheel dropped into a rut. The first few times, Mara's muscles tightened by habit. Taza did not shift closer or away. He simply occupied the space required and no more. After a mile, she stopped noticing. They ate corn cakes while moving. The cakes were dry enough to pull moisture from the mouth. Mara passed him the new cup filled from their water jug. Taza examined it. "The other one is damaged?" "No." "Then why another?" "Because sharing one cup is inefficient." He drank and handed it back. "Of course." She heard the amusement in his voice and looked straight ahead so he would not see her smile. The homestead appeared at sunset. The thin canal reflected the sky like a copper thread. Water moved steadily into the garden ditch. The dead corn still stood, but the soil around its roots remained dark. Near the porch, a pair of quail scratched in the damp ground. Mara stopped the wagon inside the gate. For years, returning home had meant checking for broken locks, unfamiliar hoofprints, and smoke. This time Taza walked the perimeter while she unharnessed the team, not because she had asked him, but because the task belonged to whoever noticed it first. She carried the bread box inside and placed the federal grant in her father's ledger. After thinking, she removed it again. "Somewhere dry that you remember." She wrapped the vellum in oilcloth, slid it into a tin document case, and set the case on the mantel between the dent cup and the clock. Taza entered, carrying split wood. He put 2 pieces beside the hearth and the rest in the box. "You should keep it below stone," he said. "I did. I forgot it for 6 years. Then the mantel is better." They cooked supper together. Mara cut onions. Taza cleaned a rabbit he had snared near the ridge. He worked outside, and when he brought the meat in it was already washed. The stew simmered in the iron pot with beans, sage, and the last wrinkled carrot from the root cellar. The first real meal in weeks filled the cabin with a smell so rich that Mara's stomach cramped before she ate. They sat across from each other. "The injunction restores the Western Passage," Mara said. "Your families can use the spring again." "Yes. When will you tell them?" "At dawn." She set down her spoon. Taza watched her. "You are leaving. The boundary stones must be moved. People are waiting." "Of course." Mara picked up her spoon again. The stew had suddenly lost some taste. Taza ate quietly. After a moment, he said, "The canal bend near the orchard will fail in a hard rain. There has been no hard rain for half a year. There will be. The soil needs it. The bend still needs stone." Mara looked at him. "How long will that take?" 2 days, perhaps 3. "You said people are waiting." "They have waited longer than 3 days." The tightness in her chest eased. "We should also raise the garden gate," she said. "The first rush will carry debris." "Yes, and the roof above the pantry leaks. That is not part of the canal." "No, but if you are staying 3 days, it would be foolish to ignore it." Taza considered her with a calm face. "Of course," he said. This time she did not hide the smile. 3 days became 6. On the first morning, they hauled river stones from the gorge. Mara drove the wagon while Taza loaded. On the second, they rebuilt the canal bend and set a cedar grate across the intake. On the third, they patched the pantry roof with split shakes and pine pitch. The work revealed more work. The north fence had sagged where Rourke cattle pressed against it during the drought. The chicken coop needed new wire. The wagon tongue had a crack. One of the porch steps rocked beneath Mara's left boot. Taza repaired what he could. Mara worked beside him, never standing idle with a cup while he labored. When he replaced the porch step, she cut the pegs. When he reset fence posts, she tamped the earth. When they repaired the wagon tongue, she shaped an iron strap at the small forge while he worked the bellows. At night, he continued sleeping near the hearth. The first evening, his blanket lay close to the door. The third, it lay nearer the fire. By the 6th, his knife hung from the peg beside Mara's rifle, and his water pouch rested on the back of a chair. Neither mentioned it. On the 7th morning, 3 people came over the western ridge. An older woman walked in front, silver threaded through her dark hair. A young man carried a child on his shoulders. Behind them came a girl with 2 empty clay jars tied to a wooden frame. Taza met them at the garden gate. Mara stayed near the porch until he motioned her forward. The older woman introduced herself as Taza Tallwater, Taza's aunt. Her English was careful but clear. She looked at the cabin, the canal, and finally the federal grant case visible through the open door. My father spoke of Samuel Ellison, she said. He said the man listened longer than soldiers usually listen. Mara glanced at Taza. That may be the kindest story anyone has told about my father. Sani smiled. He was not kind at first. He was stubborn. That sounds true. He returned to the council fire 3 nights. On the 3rd, he brought seed corn and left his rifle with the horses. Taza's version had been right after all. The visitors followed the canal west to the spring corridor. Rourke's false boundary still stood in the wash, each painted with a blue stripe. Taza and the young man levered them from the earth. Mara helped roll them into the wagon. A week later, federal surveyors would replace them with iron posts bearing territorial stamps. For now, the empty holes looked like wounds cleaned of infection. At the spring, the girl filled her jars. The child crouched and pressed both hands into the cold flow, laughing when water ran up his sleeves. Mara watched from beneath the sandstone shelf. The spring produced no more water than before, yet sharing it did not make it disappear. The fact seemed simple enough to embarrass everyone who had built power on pretending otherwise. Sani touched the clay wall of the channel. You sealed this? Mara did, Taza said. The older woman examined the smooth surface and the fitted stones. She nodded once, as if judging a basket or a saddle stitch. It will hold. The approval warmed Mara more than praise from Pendleton had. They ate beneath the overhang. Rabbit, corn cakes, dried berries, and beans carried in a clay pot. The child fell asleep against Sani's side. The young man told Taza that 2 Rourke riders had already left the northern spring after hearing of the federal order. They pulled the fence? Taza asked. Most of it. They left the posts. We will remove them tomorrow. Mara looked at him. We? Taza's gaze met hers. You have a wagon? And a repaired wheel brace. It still holds. So far. Sani looked from one to the other and said nothing, but her smile deepened. The next day, Mara traveled west with Taza. It was the first time she crossed beyond the gorge into the higher canyon country. The trail narrowed between red walls and climbed through pinon and juniper. Small dwellings stood in sheltered cuts, built from stone, timber, and earth. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children carried water. Women spread corn on woven mats to dry. No one treated Taza as a solitary guardian from a story. They handed him tools, asked questions, and expected answers. An old man complained that Taza had promised to repair a roof before the drought. A little boy climbed his back without asking. Taza carried the child while pulling fence staples from a post. Mara saw him laugh for the first time. The sound was brief and deep. It changed his whole face. She looked away before he caught her watching. They removed Rourke's wire from the northern spring. Mara used pliers while Taza and 2 others pulled posts. The work took the day. At noon, a woman named Lela offered Mara stew thickened with ground corn. It tasted of green chile and smoke. You gave him water, Lela said. Mara nearly choked. Does everyone know? Taza does not tell stories about himself. Leela nodded toward Sani. His aunt does. Across the clearing, Taza was lifting a post from the ground. Mara said it was 1 cup. Leela stirred the pot. 1 cup is a great deal when no one else will bring it. Mara had no answer. They returned to the homestead after dark. Taza walked beside the wagon for the final mile. Moonlight silvered the canal. The cabin windows reflected the lantern Mara had left burning low. At the gate he stopped. The northern spring is open, he said. Yes. The canal bend is secure. Yes, the roof no longer leaks. Not above the pantry. The Rourke riders will not cross the federal posts. Mara set the brake but kept her hands on the reins. He was listing completed obligations, balancing the debt. You said the earth remembered, she said. It does. Does it also decide when a debt is paid? Taza looked toward the dark orchard where he had slept the first night. No. Then who does? The people carrying it. Mara climbed down from the wagon. I did not bring you water so you would owe me a life, she said. And you did not save the well so you could own mine. No. So there is no debt. No. The word hung between them. Mara glanced at the cabin. There is work. There will always be work. Yes. You may stay while it suits you. Taza's face remained still, but his eyes warmed. And when it no longer suits you, Mara continued, you may go without owing an explanation. He studied her for a long moment. Those are fair terms. They are not terms. What are they? Mara looked at the second tin cup tied to the wagon rail. An open door, she said. Taza picked up the water jug and carried it inside. The open door changed the cabin in small ways before it changed anything large. Taza built a low shelf near the hearth for his knife, sharpening stone, and leather pouch. Mara moved the flour bin 6 inches to make room. He began leaving his moccasins beside the porch step. She stopped waking when the floor creaked under his weight before dawn. They still worked separately when the work required it. Mara kept the ledger. Taza walked the western boundary and watched the spring corridor. He hunted in the high country and returned with meat wrapped in hide. She preserved what they could not eat, cutting thin strips and hanging them above a slow smoke of juniper. There were disagreements. Taza wanted to widen the canal intake before the rains. Mara thought the lower ditch would wash out first. They stood in the garden with shovels in hand, pointing at grades and arguing without raising their voices. "The water will come fastest from the gorge," he said. "And slow at the first bend," she replied. "The lower ditch sits in loose soil. It will break toward the barn. The first bend carries stone. The lower ditch carries my winter seed." Taza looked at the rows where Mara had planted a small trial of the heirloom corn found in her father's trunk. They reinforced the lower ditch first. 2 days later, Taza widened the intake alone. Mara noticed the work, but said nothing. That evening, she put an extra biscuit in his bowl. In late August, the federal surveyors arrived with iron posts and a copy of Pendleton's injunction. They rode the entire boundary, measuring from the granite ridge rather than Rourke's false markers. Mara followed in the wagon with water and stakes. Taza guided them through the western cut. At the northern line, they found 12 Rourke cattle grazing inside the tract. The animals were gaunt, their hip bones sharp beneath their hides. One had a rope burn around its neck where it had broken through a tether. The survey captain asked Mara whether she wanted the cattle seized as evidence of violation. She looked at the dry grass and the calves bawling behind the cows. "Drive them back," she said. "Do not hold them from water." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Rourke would not show you the same mercy." "I am not Rourke." Taza met her gaze but offered no approval in front of the men. Later, while they reset a canal stone, he said, "The cattle did not draw the survey. No, they only followed grass." "Yes, that was a good choice." Mara pressed clay into the seam. "Do not make too much of it," I said 4 words. "That is a great many for you." He almost smiled. News from Dry Creek arrived in pieces. Gentry remained in federal custody. Sterling had surrendered the books and agreed to testify against the municipal judge. Rourke's bank had called several loans after the injunction cut him off from the Western Springs. He began selling cattle at poor prices before they died. Some people celebrated his fall. Mara did not. She knew how quickly fear could turn a town cruel, and how easy it was to believe one ruined man had carried all the guilt. Pike still sat on the council. The merchants still overcharged widows. Men who had laughed at the punishment post still drank at the saloon each night. A judgment could stop a hand. It could not repair every mind attached to it. So Mara kept her attention on the land. The heirloom corn sprouted in the dampened row. The leaves emerged narrow and green, then broadened. Beans climbed poles Taza cut from willow. Mara planted winter squash near the canal where the soil stayed cool. Nothing grew quickly enough to fill the empty bins before frost, but growth itself changed the sound of the homestead. Insects returned. Birds came at dawn. The garden no longer rattled like dry paper whenever the wind rose. One evening, Mara found Taza standing beside the old deep pump. He had removed the iron cap and lowered a stone on a cord. He listened for the splash, then marked the wet length with his thumb. "How low?" she asked. "Still falling. The spring is enough for us." "For us," he said. The words held no demand, but Mara heard the future inside them. She leaned against the pump housing. "My father believed the deep well would make the land independent. Nothing with roots is independent. He would argue with you. Your father argued with everyone." Mara looked toward the mantle visible through the open door, where the federal grant rested in its tin case. Apparently he also made agreements, after arguing. "That I believe." Taza pulled the stone from the shaft and replaced the cap. Mara watched him tighten the bolts. "Do you think he knew your grandfather's family would protect the spring after he died? He knew the covenant would outlive both of them." "That is not the same thing." "No. Then why hide it?" Taza considered the question. "Perhaps he did not hide it from you. Perhaps he expected to show you before he died." Mara looked down at her hands. Samuel's death had been quick. A fever began after he repaired fence in sleet. 3 days later he could not stand. On the final morning he had tried to tell Mara something about the cellar, but coughing broke the words apart. She had thought he wanted apples from the cold shelf. For years she had carried irritation at the memory. irritation that he had left no clear instructions, that even dying he had made her guess. Now the unfinished sentence changed shape. "He tried," she said. Taza waited. "I did not understand, you understand now." Mara looked west where evening light lay red along the canyon rim. Late. The seed in the trunk was old. It still grew. Yes. She let out a slow breath. The next morning she planted the remaining red corn in a sealed clay jar and labeled it with the date, the spring name, and the words Ellison Tallwater Covenant Seed. The act would have embarrassed her father, which gave her some satisfaction. September brought colder nights and a smell of rain that never quite became rain. Clouds gathered, thinned, and passed. The air changed direction. Taza began studying the sky more often. Mara checked the roof, the ditch gates, and the wagon cover. They stacked firewood under the porch and moved the winter stores onto shelves above floor level. The canal continued its quiet work. One afternoon, Mara was cutting the last ears from the old corn when a rider appeared at the eastern boundary. She recognized Caleb Rourke before he reached the federal post. He rode alone on a different horse, a narrow chestnut without silver on the bridle. His coat was dusty. The fine hat remained, but the band was sweat-stained. Taza saw him from the barn and came to stand near the garden. He carried no weapon. Rourke stopped outside the line. For a moment the three of them remained in silence. "I came for my cattle," Rourke said. "They were returned weeks ago." Mara replied, "Not all." 3 strays crossed the ridge. Mara had found them that morning near the western pasture, too weak to travel far. "They are in the lower corral," she said. "You may take them from the gate. You may not cross the post." Rourke looked at Taza. "Still guarding what is not yours." Taza answered, "I am standing where I choose." Rourke's gaze moved to the green strip of garden, the flowing ditch, and the repaired cabin. His own land beyond the ridge remained brown. "You think this little spring makes you safe," he said to Mara. "Winter will teach you otherwise. Winter teaches everyone. I could have made this valley rich. You tried to make it yours. What is the difference?" Mara considered him. There was no crowd to impress and no judge to defeat. Only a tired man on a tired horse, looking at the piece of land he had failed to take. "The difference is who gets to remain human," she said. Rourke's face hardened, but he had no answer that mattered. Mara opened the outer corral gate while Taza held the inner fence. The 3 cattle moved out slowly, ribs showing. Rourke turned them east. Before leaving, he looked back once. "Pendleton will not always be here." Mara rested one hand on the federal iron post. "The Grant will, and the Canyon will," Taza said. Rourke rode away. They watched until he disappeared behind the ridge. Mara closed the gate. "Do you think he will return?" "Yes." She looked at him. "For more cattle," Taza added. Mara laughed. The first true storm announced itself at dusk 3 weeks later. The light changed before the clouds appeared. The western sky took on a dull yellow cast, and the birds vanished from the fence. Wind came down from the high country carrying the scent of wet stone. Taza stopped sharpening his knife. Mara looked up from the harness she was mending. "The air has dropped," he said. The lantern flame leaned inside its glass. Mara stood. The wagon canvas, and the canal bend. They moved at once. Outside, the wind lifted dust in broad sheets. The clouds had climbed over the eastern ridge, dark purple underneath and silver at the edges. Lightning flashed within them without sound. Mara climbed into the wagon bed and pulled the canvas tight while Taza secured the ropes below. The first knot slipped from her cold fingers. He caught the loose line before it whipped away and handed it back without comment. They covered the seed sacks, moved tools into the shed, and opened the lower garden gate to receive runoff. Taza checked the intake grate while Mara walked the canal with a lantern, pressing each clay seam with the ironwood trowel. At the bend near the orchard, she found a small crack. Taza. He came down the ditch, carrying a flat stone. Together they packed clay beneath it and wedged it into place. The wind tore dead leaves from the apple trees and drove them against their backs. The temperature dropped so quickly that Mara's wet palms went numb. They reached the porch just as a heavy drop smacked the railing, leaving a round, dark mark. Another landed on the dust near Taza's foot. Then the rain came. It fell hard enough to erase the yard in seconds. Water hammered the cedar roof, overflowed the gutters, and streamed from the brim of Mara's hat. Dust became mud beneath her boots. The smell of wet sage rose so strongly that she could taste it. Mara stood beyond the porch overhang and let the rain strike her face. She had imagined this moment during the worst nights of the drought. In those imaginings she had wept or shouted or fallen to her knees. Instead, she laughed once and wiped water from her eyes. Taza stepped into the rain beside her. He tilted his face upward. Water ran through his hair and along the scars on his chest. The canal filled. Mara leaned over the railing. Dark water rushed from the western intake, curved around the reinforced stones, and spread through the lower ditch. The cedar grate caught twigs and leaves. The repaired seam held. Runoff moved toward the garden instead of the barn. "It is carrying too fast," she said. Taza watched the bend. "The wall is holding. For now, everything is for now." She looked at him. Rain ran down his face. He looked less like the silent figure from the punishment post, more like the man who argued about ditch grades, disliked coffee, repaired wheel braces, and allowed children to climb his back. Mara stepped closer and placed her hand on his forearm. The contact was deliberate. She felt the warmth of his skin beneath the cold rain and the muscle ease under her palm. "We gave it a chance to stand," she said. "Yes, not I, not you, we." The storm deepened. Thunder rolled through the canyon, close enough to shake the porch posts. "The wind is turning colder," Mara said. Taza looked toward the cabin. Firelight moved in the doorway. "Inside," he said. They entered together. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, damp wool, and the sourdough loaf Mara had left cooling near the hearth. Taza closed the door. The old iron bar still leaned against the wall. He did not lift it. Mara hung her coat from a peg. Water pooled beneath it. She removed the dented tin cup from the mantel and set it under a leak near the chimney stones. Drops struck the metal with a clear, irregular note. Taza looked at the cup. "You said the roof no longer leaked," she said. "Not above the pantry." She smiled. Of course, they ate bread and stew while the storm worked around them. The canal remained audible through the wall, a steady rushing beneath the drumming rain. Once, Taza went to the door to listen. Mara did not ask whether he was checking for riders or water. Both dangers belonged to the same world, and neither required explanation. When he returned to the table, she moved the second chair closer to the hearth. Taza sat. Mara picked up the harness. He took out his knife and sharpening stone. The familiar scrape of stiefel-till settled into the room. "You may keep the shelf," she said. He looked toward the low board near the hearth. "I had not planned to steal it. I mean after winter." The knife stopped. Mara continued working the needle through leather. Her voice remained steady because her hands needed it to. "If you choose to go west when the road's clear, the shelf will wait. If you choose to return, it will still be yours. If you choose not to go." She pulled the stitch tight. "Then we should build a better one." Taza set the stone down. "What would a better shelf hold? More than one knife, your bow. The awl. That pouch you leave on my chair. It is not your chair when the pouch is on it. That is exactly the problem." He watched her for a long moment. Then he said, "We will build it after the storm." Mara nodded and returned to the harness. Outside, the rain continued through the night. By morning, the dead basin had changed color. The soil around the cabin was nearly black. Pools reflected the clearing sky. The air smelled washed and raw. Water still moved through the canal, slower now, carrying fine silt into the garden beds. Mara and Taza walked the full channel before breakfast. One upper wall had slumped. The cedar grate was packed with debris. A retaining stone had shifted 2 inches at the lower bend. Nothing had failed. Mara wrote the damage in her ledger. 3 repairs, she said. Taza looked over her shoulder. "And how many sections held?" She glanced along the channel. "Most of them." "Write that. The ledger records problems." "Then it lies." Mara looked at the page. Below the repair list, she wrote, "Canal held through first autumn storm." After a pause, she added, "Built by M. Ellison and T. Tallwater." Taza read the line and nodded. The season turned. Frost silvered the garden in October. The heirloom corn produced small, hard ears in red and yellow. Mara saved nearly all of them for seed. The bean vines gave enough to fill 2 jars. 3 winter squash ripened near the warm south wall. It was not abundance, but it was proof. Taza built the wider shelf. Mara added a second peg beside her rifle. His bow hung there by November. Families from the canyon used the western passage without asking permission. They also brought things: dried meat, woven mats, seed, news, and laughter that filled the yard in a way Mara's father would have pretended to dislike. Sani taught Mara how to roast the red corn until it split without burning. Mara showed Sani the ledger entry for the canal. "Numbers," Sani said. "My father trusted them. Your father trusted water. He trusted numbers about water." Sani laughed. Dry Creek changed more slowly. Pike lost his council seat in the winter election. Mrs. Finch began keeping a barrel of drinking water outside the bakery during hot days, free to anyone who needed it. The punishment post was removed after Pendleton ordered it inspected. and the carpenter declared the timber unsafe. Children carried away pieces for firewood. The town did not become kind all at once. No town does. But certain cruelties became harder to perform in public. Caleb Rourke sold half his range before spring. He kept the house, a smaller herd, and enough land to remain what he had always feared becoming, one rancher among others. Mara saw him twice in town. They did not speak. Gentry was sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison. Sterling kept his house after testifying, though he never held public office again. When Mara paid her next tax, a new clerk entered the amount while she watched and handed her 2 receipts. She kept one in the flour tin and one beside the grant. Winter settled over the basin with snow along the western rim. The cabin walls creaked in the cold. Taza sealed the chimney leak. Mara made a mattress from ticking stuffed with dried grass and wool. It lay in the corner opposite her cot for less than a month. One night in January, wind pushed snow beneath the door. They woke to a white line across the floorboards. Taza rose to fit a new threshold strip. Mara watched him kneel in the lantern light, hair loose over his shoulders, measuring the gap with a piece of cord. "You know," she said, "the iron bar would stop the door from shifting. It would not stop the snow." "No." He looked back at her. "Do you want it in place?" Mara considered the bar gathering dust against the wall. "No." He returned to the threshold. In the morning, they carried the bar to the shed and used it as a brace beneath the workbench. In February, a night storm tested more than the roof. Snow came sideways from the western cut and piled against the barn doors. Near midnight, the bay mare began kicking her stall wall. Mara woke to the sound through 2 layers of timber and sat upright before Taza had fully risen. "Something is wrong in the barn." They crossed the yard with one lantern between them. Wind snatched at Mara's coat and blew powder into her eyes. Inside the barn, the mare stood sweating despite the cold, looking back at her belly. Her water had broken early. Mara had helped deliver calves and foals before, but never in weather cold enough to freeze a wet newborn within minutes. She filled a bucket at the spring cistern while Taza spread clean straw and hung 2 horse blankets near the lantern. The labor lasted more than an hour. The foal came wrong, one foreleg folded back. Mara knelt behind the mare, sleeve wet to the shoulder, and worked by touch. Taza held the animal's head, speaking to her in a low voice that the wind could not reach. When Mara's cramped hand finally found the hidden hoof, she guided it forward between contractions. "Now," she said. Taza tightened his grip on the lead rope. The mare strained. The foal slid onto the straw, limp and steaming in the cold air. For one terrible second it did not breathe. Mara tore the membrane from its nose and rubbed the narrow chest with a feed sack. Taza lifted the foal's hindquarters just enough to drain its airway. The little body shuddered. Then it coughed and drew a thin, ragged breath. Mara laughed once, almost a sob. They dried it together and wrapped it in the warmed blankets. Before dawn, it stood on trembling legs beneath its mother. Mara sat against the stall wall, exhausted, straw in her hair and birth fluid dried across her sleeve. Taza lowered himself beside her. Their shoulders touched. "You heard the mare before I did," he said. "I know the sound of trouble in my own barn, and I know the sound of you pretending not to be tired." She turned her head. "That sounds like an accusation." "It is an observation." The foal found its balance, bumped the mare's side, and began to nurse. Taza held out his hand. Mara took it and let him pull her to her feet. They crossed back to the cabin in the blue light before sunrise. At the porch, Mara slipped on ice. Taza caught her around the waist. The contact was sudden, close, and entirely practical. Yet when she steadied, neither of them released the other at once. Snow gathered in Taza's hair. Mara could feel his breath against her forehead. "The ground lies when it freezes," she said softly. "Only to people who walk too quickly." She rested one hand against his chest. "Then we should go slowly." They did. By early spring, the canal ran full with snowmelt. Green spread across the lower pasture. Cottonwoods leafed along the wash. The deep pump recovered enough to draw clear water again, but Mara used it sparingly. The spring channel had taught her not to depend on one source merely because it belonged to her deed. They planted the saved corn in 4 rows. Taza made the furrows. Mara placed the kernels. At the end of the final row, she covered the last seed and sat back on her heels. The sun warmed the damp soil. A meadowlark sang from the fence. Taza handed her the ironwood trowel. Its handle had darkened from use and fit her palm more closely than before. Mara brushed earth from the carved grooves. "The slate would have broken," she said. "Yes, my hands healed, yes." The trowel did not do that. "No." She looked at him. "You could disagree once in a while." I disagree often, silently. It saves time. Mara laughed. They rose and walked back toward the cabin. On the porch, 2 cups waited beside a clay pitcher, one bright tin dulled by a year of use, the other dented and scratched. Mara poured water into both. She handed the old cup to Taza. He looked at it. This one is yours. It was. And now it is the one that started the trouble. Taza drank. Mara lifted the newer cup. The water was cold from the spring, clean enough to show the sky in its surface. Beyond the porch, the canal moved through the garden with a soft, steady sound. Corn shoots marked the rows. The federal post stood at the eastern line. Farther west, the canyon passage remained open. The land was not safe because danger had vanished. Drought would return. Winter would break fences. Men would make new papers and new excuses. Safety had become something more practical than certainty. It was a channel repaired after storms, a document kept where it could be found, a door that opened by choice, a second set of footsteps in the dark. Mara sat on the porch step. Taza sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. They drank in silence while the deep earth fed the spring, and the spring fed everything they had chosen to build.